let's say for instance, NBA live pass, are there major issues with geoblocking? So is there a conflict between live streaming of games on a mobile phone and let's say video rights of
There is. I think the NBA has been quite clever in navigating those challenges, and actually probably benefits to some extent from some of the geographical limitations. I know that the price point for an NBA League Pass is much more expensive in Australia than it is in Sri Lanka, or India, and they've been able to moderate their pricing model to appeal to markets and really bring in new fans. So in some ways they've capitalised on some of those challenges, but no, it certainly does create some potential issues around overspill and geo-blocking, how that's managed in particularly in large markets that already have existing long-range rights deals. And at least in my experience, many of those rights holders have locked up the digital rights anyway. So, but yeah, it's a very complex and evolving area.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. I think that brings us on to, I guess, the final general area that we're discussing is still related to innovation and let's say apps. I think a quite popular app, especially being English, loving football, would be something like fantasy football, the Premier League app. Have you seen, and I guess there has been an uptake in these kind of games, but could you, any three of you, explain or give comments on any challenges that are being faced and opportunities that arise from fan engagement globally just by having apps such as FPL?
See, Natalie, this has been the biggest sector as far as I have seen. Actually, this never used to exist in countries like India, Middle East, or Singapore. Like fantasy sports was like unheard of, and you couldn't bet because it was illegal. In India, where I come from, only betting on horse races was allowed. All other betting was illegal. We've had a lot of court cases now with regard to these fantasy sports, and I'm glad to tell you that most of them have gone in favor of the providers. Because fantasy sports are termed as games of skill, not games of chance. So that's the question in law that is put in the courts, whether it's a game of chance or a game of skill. So fantasy sports are a game of skill. So that's one thing which we need to understand. And in most of the countries which follow common law, because all these sports laws have an overlap between the common law and the civil law. So a lawyer who practices into sports has to understand both sides. But any country which has common law, I think this argument that games of skill would be allowed is a big plus. And this has seen a big uptick. Like you would have billions of dollars going into this, 150 billion in India alone on fantasy sports. So you can judge the size of the market. Size of the market is big. There are over 1,000 players now. And I see a lot of work for the lawyers coming in because there are going to be legal challenges on this and they are going to continue. And we can actually make our do out of it because there are always going to be questions and always going to be legal changes. Thank you.
So you mentioned that betting in India is illegal. I know that Genius Sports, we have the data rights to a number of rights holders in India, so we sell the betting rights. And then obviously we have to deal with the related integrity issues. So could you kind of explain how Indians are able to bet on these sporting events without it being legal?
See, India's been very slow in enacting new laws on internet betting. One. So there is no new law. We are governed by a law from 1800s, which the Britishers made with regards to betting. So all these things, like in US, you have the Internet Betting Act. In Singapore, we have a law. In India, you have no law. So anybody who's doing it, of course, you would find it tough if you stop paying them. They would find it tough to recover it. But yes, there is no way anybody's stopping them from betting on the platforms. Plus, as I said, even if there is a slight element of skill, that's legal. So if I have to choose a team from the various teams, and that's my fantasy team which is betting against the others, and it does well and I make money, that's perfectly legal. If it's a game of chance, of course, at this moment, only the person who's putting his money on the bet has a risk, because he would find it tough recovering the money if the provider stops paying. The provider has very little risk.
The Australian context is a little different. So online sports betting is legal, but it's heavily regulated, and there are some, I guess, professional sports in Australia, and it's probably similar in other jurisdictions, other mature sports or professional sports jurisdictions, have a very uneasy relationship with betting generally. There's obviously, it's a very appealing source of revenue, and it's an enormous industry, $1.7 trillion a year. But it's also a magnet for organised crime, and as a sports body, you're constantly very worried about risk and about things like match fixing and integrity risks. So the whole space of betting poses a unique set of risks to a rights holder, to a sports body, and a lot of those risks are very difficult to control when sports betting is unregulated. And so what you see in Australia is that the regulations permit betting on sport, but not in-game betting. So that's intended to reduce the opportunities for influencing the outcome of matches, which is an integrity concern. But it doesn't mean that in-game betting doesn't happen. It just means that people look for those products outside Australia in unregulated markets, including India. That doesn't solve the problem, but it makes it, I guess, a bit more difficult for the opportunities to influence.
Yeah, but that's great opportunity for lawyers, because that's everybody's being exposed to a lot of risks, including the sports bodies, including the company which is doing the ad, and the provider which is airing all that. Everybody is subject to litigation in that. And it's a good opportunity for lawyers, because everybody's going to come to you asking you for your opinion. And I think in India, recently, as I said, most of the games and most of the gaming platforms have won their court cases, even in Supreme Court. Like even a game like Ludo is there. That's a dice game, and they say that that's also skill. The way you use the dice and the way so even that's under consideration. And I think till they come up with a new legislation, and I would like to bring to your attention UAE, which actually does not actually allow you to do any kind of betting. Everything is happening there. All the fantasy sports are live, and it's called internet gaming. And in the garb of that, everybody's betting, and that's huge there. And that's like the UAE wants to attract all the tech, and gaming is a part of that. And a lot of these companies have set up their companies in DMCC area, where they have this special zone for technology companies, and they're all engaged in betting. So I would like to say that this is huge, like 150 billion in India alone. If I look at these countries, the Middle East and North Africa, you would see another, say, 200 billion running on the line. Of course, the influence of matches and the match fixing and other things that are concerned, but that's for the boards to handle. For us, it's good money, and if they get caught, it's even better.
One legal solution that has been developed in Australia to address this particular problem is the requirement for betting operators to enter into contractual agreements with sports. So if you're a betting operator operating markets on a sport in Australia, you need to have a contract with that sport that firstly provides the payment of a fee from the betting operator to the sport. Those fees are required to be reinvested in integrity programs that are designed to buttress some of the risks that we're talking about. It also gives the sport a level of visibility of the markets that are being offered on his sport. And what I think we've seen, I know that Natalie would know more about this, but in the integrity space, there's higher integrity risks at lower levels of sport. That's certainly been the case in tennis. The opportunities to influence a provincial game or even a juniors game is much more concerning to a rights holder. So sports have the ability to prohibit certain markets being offered on certain levels of sport. And I think that having that level of control over the types of betting products that are on your sport is a really attractive thing to a rights holder. And it also, the final aspect of these agreements that are helpful is that there's a mandatory disclosure regime. So the sport will provide a list of employees, for example, and if an employee of the sport is found to be betting on that sport, perhaps they have information of an injury or a strategy that the larger public does not have access to, and that type of sort of insider trading activity is mandatorily reported by the betting operator. So there are legal solutions here, and they're not perfect, but there's certainly an area that rights holders really stress about.
Yeah, basically these are